You begin in a world that still believes it cannot end. The air over the Tiber is soft and gold. From the 7 hills, the eternal city stretches in every direction, a patchwork of rooftops, courtyards, domes, and marble. The morning light touches the great arches of the aqueducts, the pillars of temples, and the tiled mosaics that shimmer like still water. Everything looks permanent. Everything feels designed to last forever. This is Rome, capital of the world. For 1,000 years, its people have lived beneath the illusion of eternity. They have watched empires rise and fall beyond their borders while their own banners never fade. Their armies once walked across the known world, from the cold mists of Britain to the burning sands of Syria. They built roads where none had been, carved order out of wilderness, and named it all Roman. Now, in the 5th century after Christ, the empire still stands, but time has begun to whisper. You wouldn't notice it at first. The marble still gleams, the markets still hum, the fountains still run with clean water brought from miles away. Senators in white togas move through the forum. Priests light incense in quiet temples. Soldiers patrol the streets. Life goes on. But beneath the calm surface, something unseen has shifted. The empire no longer grows. It endures. Once, Rome's greatness was a living force, sharp, hungry, expanding. Now, it is a habit, a tradition, a memory of power carried forward by people who no longer remember how it was made. The legions still exist, but they no longer march across continents. They guard frontiers, brittle lines along rivers and mountains, where loyalty is bought with gold rather than pride. Many of the soldiers are no longer Roman at all. They speak strange dialects, worship strange gods, and serve an empire they barely know. The Senate still meets in marble halls, but its debates no longer shape the world. The laws are copied, revised, and ignored. The emperor still rules, but he rules from afar, in Milan or Ravenna, or wherever safety and politics demand. And yet, for ordinary Romans, the illusion remains unbroken. The baker still sells his bread at dawn. The bathhouses still fill with steam and gossip. The theatres still echo with laughter. Rome, they say, has always been and will always be. The empire has always drawn strength from its order. Its roads stretch across the continent like veins. They bind together faraway provinces, Gaul, Hispania, Africa, Egypt, carrying grain, soldiers, taxes, and ideas. The empire is a living organism, fed by motion. From Africa come the grain ships that feed the cities. From the north come metals and timber. From the east come silk, spices, and stories. Each province sends its wealth to Rome, and Rome sends back its laws. This balance of tribute and protection, of tax and authority, has lasted for centuries. But now the roads grow rougher. Caravans take longer to arrive. Ships return half empty. The flow slows almost imperceptibly, like the first frost on a river. In its earliest days, Rome's power rested on discipline. Every citizen, every soldier, every magistrate believed they were part of something greater, a republic, an idea of civilization. The legions conquered not for plunder, but for permanence. They built cities wherever they went, leaving behind walls, baths, temples, and Latin words that still cling to the landscape. But ideals grow thin with time. By the late empire, conquest had become memory. The frontier was fixed, and with it came stagnation. The machinery of government expanded endlessly. Tax collectors, administrators, clerks, and courtiers. Every new crisis demanded another reform, another office, another decree. The bureaucracy grew heavier than the sword. And as the system thickened, the soul of Rome, that restless drive to build and expand, began to fade. Still, the city remains magnificent. Walk its streets at dusk, and you will see the monuments glowing in the evening light. The Pantheon stands with its perfect dome, open to the sky. The Colosseum looms like a broken crown, its stones scarred by age but unbowed. Fountains spill water into marble basins. Children chase pigeons across the forum, their laughter echoing off ancient walls. The smell of bread and wine drifts from the taverns. Musicians play near the steps of old temples, where the statues of forgotten gods watch in silence. For a moment, it feels as if nothing has changed, as if the empire will simply go on forever, carried by its own weight. And yet, if you listen closely, you can hear the strain beneath the beauty. The aqueducts require constant repair. The grain ships grow fewer each season. The treasury empties faster than it fills. Even the marble cracks. Rome still stands, but the effort of standing grows heavier each year. Beyond the city walls, the countryside tells a quieter story. Once, it was dotted with small farms, worked by free citizens who fed the empire and filled its armies. Now, those farms belong to great estates, villas owned by the rich, worked by peasants bound to the land. The free farmer, once the backbone of Rome, is disappearing. The great estates produce wealth for their owners, but little for the state. Many of those owners now live far from Rome, in Gaul, in Africa, in Sicily, managing their lands as private kingdoms. They build their own walls, hire their own guards, and depend less and less on imperial protection. The empire is still vast, but its pieces are loosening. Inside the city, the people adapt. Some cling to the old gods, lighting candles before crumbling statues of Jupiter and Mars. Others fill the new churches that have risen across Rome, singing hymns in Latin and Greek. Christianity is no longer a whispered faith. It is now the empire's heart, gentle to the poor, patient to the weary, promising eternity beyond the crumbling marble of this world. Religion gives the people comfort, but it also changes the empire's soul. The gods of conquest and glory have given way to saints of patience and mercy. Rome's faith turns inward, away from empire and toward eternity. The Romans still speak proudly of their city, Urbs Aeterna, the eternal city, but fewer now believe it in their hearts. They see the statues worn smooth by time. They see the ivy creeping up the temple walls. They hear the silence where once there was music and laughter. But habit is powerful. The senators still wear their robes. The soldiers still salute. The priests still bless the crowds. Every ritual continues, even as its meaning fades. And so the empire drifts, not collapsing, not dying, but dimming. Far to the north and east, the world beyond the empire is stirring. Tribes move through forests and across rivers. New kingdoms form and vanish. To these people, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Huns, Rome is both mystery and temptation. They trade with it, serve in its armies, imitate its ways. They dream of its wealth and envy its age. They have heard of its golden palaces and its endless roads. They have seen its weakness. For now, they come as allies, not conquerors, federati, soldiers paid to defend what was once Rome's own frontier. But alliances shift with the wind. The empire no longer commands, it negotiates. Even at its height, Rome feared the barbarians. Now, it depends on them. And still, life goes on. The baker kneads his dough at dawn. The senator reviews his accounts. The priest lights candles before the altar. The widow in the alley sweeps her doorway and watches the same sun rise over the same hills as it did in the days of Augustus. History does not announce its turning points. It whispers them through routine. In 1,000 small ways, the empire is already changing, not in its monuments, but in the hearts of its people. To be Roman once was to belong to the most powerful civilization on earth. It meant law, language, order, and pride. To be Roman was to live under the banner of eternity. Now it means something quieter, a memory of greatness carried like an heirloom, a habit of dignity kept alive even as the world grows smaller. The empire still exists, but the spirit that built it has grown tired. It is not yet tragedy. It is still peace. The roads are open. The grain still comes. The people still dream of tomorrow. But the edges of that dream are beginning to blur. Night falls over the city. The lamps are lit one by one. The wind moves softly through the ruins of older temples. Somewhere, a poet writes by candlelight, and his words speak of Rome as if it were already a ghost. The empire does not know it is dying. It only knows that it is old. The marble glows faintly under the moon, and the Tiber flows as it always has, slow, patient, endless. Rome sleeps, believing it will wake again to find the world unchanged. The weight of empire. The empire is vast, too vast. From the cold mists of Britannia to the deserts of Egypt, Rome stretches across 3 continents, bound together by roads, laws, and habit. It is an empire of cities and farms, of senators and slaves, of temples and tax collectors. Its borders run along mountains and rivers so distant that most citizens will never see them. For centuries, this size was its strength. Now, it is its burden. The Roman world depends on motion, ships crossing the sea, caravans carrying grain, legions marching from one end of the world to the other. The empire lives because it moves. When it slows, it begins to starve, and lately, it has begun to slow. The machinery of Rome is immense. Every province, every town, every farm exists within a web of administration. Clerks counting grain, scribes recording taxes, governors sending endless reports to distant capitals. The empire's greatest achievement is not its army or its art, but its ability to make millions of people follow the same rules. Yet over time, rules multiply faster than the people who follow them. What began as order becomes bureaucracy. Each new crisis creates another layer of officials, another office, another form to be filled. Governors now spend more time writing letters than governing. Taxes are collected, but never enough. Corruption grows quietly, like ivy on a wall. The state becomes a living thing that exists to feed itself, and the people, who once believed they were the empire, now simply live beneath it. In the streets of Rome, this change is invisible. The baker still sells his loaves. The merchants still weigh their coins. The baths still fill with steam and conversation. But in the countryside, where most of the empire truly lives, the weight of Rome presses heavily. Taxes fall hardest on the poor. The free farmer, once the symbol of Roman virtue, is crushed between rising rents and imperial demands. Many abandon their lands, fleeing to the protection of great estates owned by the wealthy. There they work as tenants, bound to the soil they once owned. It is quieter, safer, but the cost is freedom. The empire has not enslaved them, but it no longer needs to. In the great villas of Italy, the rich retreat from public life. Once, senators governed provinces and commanded armies. Now, they tend gardens and copy poetry. Their estates are self-contained worlds, producing their own food, wine, and labor. The empire beyond their walls feels distant, a rumor of wars and taxes. Many pay bribes instead of taxes. Others simply ignore imperial commands altogether. Rome's authority remains impressive on parchment, but it is thinning in practice. The old Roman ideal of virtues, public service, and civic duty has faded into nostalgia. Power now lies not in the Senate, but in the palace, and emperors come and go with the seasons. By the 4th century, it is rare for an emperor to die peacefully. Most are killed by their guards, overthrown by generals, or poisoned in their sleep. Each new ruler promises restoration. Each inherits the same decay. Civil wars erupt not from ideology, but exhaustion. Soldiers fighting for pay, not principle. Every rebellion drains the treasury. Every defeat opens another door along the frontier. Rome no longer fears its enemies as much as it fears itself. To hold such a world together requires constant vigilance. Legions must be fed, roads must be repaired, fortresses maintained, ships supplied. the costs never end, and the revenues never quite meet them. Inflation rises, coins lose their silver, people begin to barter instead of buy. In some provinces, taxes are collected in kind, wheat instead of money, cattle instead of coin. The imperial treasury swells with goods it cannot eat. And yet, for all its weariness, the empire still tries to look strong. Triumphal arches are built even when there is no victory to celebrate. Statues are erected to emperors who rule only months. The rhetoric of eternity continues, though no one truly believes it. The empire has learned to perform strength long after it has forgotten what strength feels like. It is a slow deception, not out of pride, but survival. When you are this old, you cannot afford to let anyone see you tremble. Far from the capital, the provinces bear the real cost. In the west, the cities of Gaul shrink, their theatres silent, their streets cracked with weeds. In the east, Constantinople grows brighter, wealthier, more alive. The split is no longer political. It is cultural, spiritual, and economic. The east thrives on trade and faith. The west survives on memory. Rome still calls itself the center of the world, but the world has quietly moved on. The people do not rebel. They endure. They always have. It is what Romans do, endure famine, war, plague, fire. They have seen all of it before, and somehow they always recover. But this decline is different. It is not a storm to outlast. It is a tide going out. You can't fight the sea. You can only watch it recede. In the countryside, life moves at its own pace. The great villas are surrounded by olive groves and vineyards. Laborers work the fields, whispering prayers to saints and spirits. Children chase chickens through the dust. The world still feels peaceful. But the peace is deceptive, the peace of fatigue. The army now draws more soldiers from foreign tribes, men who know little of Latin and less of Rome's history. They fight for coin and for land, not for glory. When the pay stops, they march home. When Rome can no longer defend the frontiers, these men will defend themselves. Every fortress built for protection becomes, in time, a prison of fear. Even the weather turns against the empire. Historians will later write of small changes in climate, colder winters, failed harvests, shifting patterns of rain. To a farmer, it feels like bad luck. To an empire built on abundance, it feels like slow starvation. Bread prices rise. The city plebs grow restless. Riots flare, not from politics, but from hunger. The empire that once fed the world can barely feed itself. The weight of Rome is not only physical, it is spiritual. Its people carry the burden of their own legend. They have inherited an empire they can no longer afford, a story they can no longer live up to. Each generation grows smaller, poorer, and more uncertain. But the past is everywhere. In the statues, the roads, the ruins. It reminds them of what they were and mocks them for what they have become. Every column and arch becomes a mirror of their own decline. Still, there is pride. Even as the provinces falter, Rome clings to ceremony. The Senate meets, though its words carry no power. The emperors still issue edicts in imperial purple. The coins still bear the image of victory. It is theatre now, a ritual to preserve dignity. And in a way, it works. Civilization survives by pretending that peace is normal, pretending that order is natural, pretending that Rome still rules the world. It is the lie that sustains the empire. At night, when the city grows quiet, the weight of all this history can be felt most clearly. The streets are empty, the lamps flicker, and the stones seem to whisper of the centuries they have seen. In those silences, the truth feels close. Rome is no longer what it was. It endures, but without purpose. Its greatness has become gravity, a force that holds it in place but drags it down all the same. In the east, Constantinople shines. New marble, new palaces, new hope. Its emperors rule with confidence, its coffers full, its defenses strong. To the east, the empire looks eternal. To the west, It looks old. The same empire, two different worlds. The balance cannot last. And so, the empire continues to bear its own weight. Slowly, quietly. Each year, the roads crumble a little more. Each year, the coins grow thinner. Each year, the people grow a little more resigned. But still they call it Rome, because to stop calling it that, to admit the truth, would be to let it die. And Rome does not die. Not yet. It simply grows heavier. The division of the realm. There comes a moment in every great system when its own size becomes a threat. The Roman Empire had grown too vast, too complex, too heavy for one mind to command. Its provinces stretched over deserts, mountains and seas, each with its own languages, loyalties and troubles. Messages took weeks to arrive. Armies took months to march. By the time the emperor heard of a rebellion, the rebellion had already changed shape. For generations, Rome had been ruled by single men who claimed divine authority, Caesars and Augusti, men who believed themselves chosen to govern the known world. But by the late 3rd century, even the most capable emperor could not be everywhere at once. And so, out of necessity, came division. It began not as a surrender, but as an act of preservation. In the year 285, the Emperor Diocletian, a soldier from humble origins, took the throne. He inherited a realm exhausted by civil war, rebellion, and economic ruin. For decades, emperors had risen and fallen like the seasons, their names forgotten before their statues were carved. The empire was tired. Diocletian's mind was not that of a dreamer, but of a builder. He did not seek glory, only endurance. His solution was simple. No one man could rule an empire so large, but perhaps 4 could. He created what history would call the tetrarchy, the rule of 4. 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, called Caesars. Together, they would share the burden of empire, each ruling a quarter of the world in the name of unity. On paper, it was perfect, a structure of balance, order, and stability. In practice, it planted the seeds of separation. From that moment onward, the empire began to think in halves, the East and the West. 2 centers of power, 2 courts, 2 armies, 2 bureaucracies, bound by allegiance but divided by distance. At first it worked. The frontiers were secured. Rebellions were crushed. The economy recovered. Diocletian reformed the coinage, stabilized prices, and reorganized the military. The empire breathed again. But balance is delicate. What begins as cooperation often becomes rivalry. When Diocletian retired, the first Roman emperor ever to do so willingly, his system did not survive him. The 4 rulers became 2, and the 2 became enemies. Civil war returned, as it always did, and when the smoke cleared, one man stood above the rest: Constantine. Constantine was more than an emperor. He was a turning point. He saw the empire not as it had been, but as it could become. Not pagan, but Christian. Not Roman, but universal. He took the divided empire and reshaped it in his image. In the year 324, he defeated his rivals and became sole ruler of Rome, the last man to rule the whole empire under one crown. But he knew the center could no longer hold in the west. Rome itself had become too crowded, too old, too fragile. So he looked east, across the Aegean Sea. On the narrow strait that linked Europe and Asia stood the old Greek city of Byzantium. It was perfectly placed, defended by water, close to the empire's richest provinces, far from the chaos of the western frontier. There, Constantine built a new capital. He named it Nova Roma, New Rome, but the world called it Constantinople. When the emperor entered his new city in 330 AD, it was said to gleam like a mirror of heaven. Marble streets, golden domes, a senate, a palace, a forum crowned with his own statue. Ships crowded its harbors, priests blessed its gates. To the east, it was a beginning, a fresh Rome, reborn in faith and splendor. To the west, it was a quiet betrayal. The old capital was no longer the heart of empire. Rome, the eternal city, was now a symbol, not a center. At first, the change was ceremonial. The emperors still honored Rome, still called themselves its guardians. But gradually, the weight of governance shifted eastward. Constantinople grew rich on trade and safe behind its walls. The eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, filled its granaries and its coffers. Meanwhile, the west grew poorer. Its lands were vast, but its wealth was thin. Its armies depended on recruits from across the Rhine. Its cities aged without renewal. The empire was still one in name, but not in spirit. The east was stable, urban, and devout. The west was rural, defensive, and fading. Like two branches of the same tree, they grew apart without realizing it. Still, the people clung to unity. They believed in the fiction of one empire, one emperor, one world. Coins bore the same image, decrees carried the same seal, messengers rode the same roads. But in practice, the empire now spoke two different languages, Latin in the west, Greek in the east. It prayed in different ways, governed with different priorities, dreamed of different futures. The Romans of Constantinople began to look eastward, toward Persia, toward Jerusalem, while the Romans of the west looked inward, trying simply to endure. The divide was not declared, it just deepened, one quiet generation at a time. The armies reflected this new reality. In the east, soldiers guarded strong fortresses, funded by wealthy provinces. In the west, they patrolled empty frontiers, their pay delayed, their armor worn thin. The generals in Constantinople were men of the court, bureaucrats in armor. The generals in Gaul were warlords in all but name. The east could afford defense, the west could only afford hope. And yet, for a while, the system held. Trade flowed between the two halves. The emperors met in ceremony, exchanged gifts, reaffirmed loyalty. From the outside, the empire looked whole. But unity is not just about geography, it is about belief. In Constantinople, people believed in the future, in renewal, in divine favor, in destiny. In Rome, people believed in the past, in what had been lost and what could not be regained. One half faced forward, the other looked back. That was the real division, not of land, but of time. As the 4th century unfolded, the contrast grew starker. In the East, Christian churches rose over old temples. Scholars translated the Bible into Greek. Gold flowed through the markets of Antioch and Alexandria. In the West, the churches were humbler, the cities poorer, the fields emptier. The population declined as plagues and famine returned. The empire's heart still beat, but it was faint. When Constantinople celebrated, Rome endured. It was not hatred that divided them, only distance and exhaustion. Even the emperors began to reflect the split. The Eastern rulers dressed in silks and governed from marble halls, surrounded by ceremony. Their laws were copied onto golden tablets and preserved for centuries. The Western emperors ruled from forts and barracks, their power dependent on generals, their reigns brief and forgettable. Their decrees were lost, their statues melted down. The East was a civilization reborn. The West was an empire surviving its own shadow. And still, the fiction of unity persisted. Maps showed one empire. The people swore loyalty to one name. But the truth was clear to anyone who traveled the roads. The two Romes were no longer one world. In the East, Constantinople gleamed like a young sun. In the West, Rome burned dimly, like an old flame refusing to die. Sometimes history does not end. It drifts apart. And that is what Rome did. It did not collapse. It divided, gracefully, almost peacefully, into halves that would never be whole again. From this division, two destinies would emerge. In the East, an empire that would endure 1,000 years longer, the Byzantine Empire, heir to Roman order and Christian faith. In the West, a slow decline into darkness, not sudden but steady, like dusk after a long day. The division of the realm was meant to save the empire, and in a way it did. Half of Rome survived, half of Rome remembered, but the unity that had made it eternal was gone. The empire no longer ruled the world, it simply ruled its half. And beyond the borders, the world was already changing. Faith and fracture. The old gods are dying, not all at once, not in fire or rage, but slowly, quietly, the way an empire fades. In the heart of Rome, the temples still stand. The columns are still white. The altars still smell faintly of incense. But the prayers have changed. The voices that once called upon Jupiter, Mars, and Venus now whisper new names: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Roman Empire is becoming Christian, and in this transformation, something beautiful is born, and something ancient begins to break. For centuries, the empire's religion had been a reflection of itself, vast, inclusive, and pragmatic. Every god had a place, every cult a shrine, every conquered people a new divinity to welcome. Rome had worshipped everything because Rome had ruled everything. It was a faith built on tolerance, but also on distance. The gods lived above, far from mortal reach. They governed, as emperors did, through silence. But Christianity was different. It spoke of one God, not in the sky, but in the heart. It promised forgiveness instead of favor, and salvation instead of success. It asked for faith, not tribute. To a weary empire, its message was irresistible. When Constantine converted in the early 4th century, it was not simply a spiritual choice. It was a political one. The emperor saw in Christianity a new glue for a world that was coming apart, a single faith for a divided empire, a single God for 1,000 cities. He legalized Christianity, then embraced it. He funded churches, convened councils, and declared himself God's chosen ruler. The old persecutions ended. The cross replaced the eagle, and for a time, it worked. The empire found renewal in this new belief, a quiet strength drawn from hope rather than conquest. But every act of unity brings its own division. As the old gods fell away, so too did the culture that had sustained them. The festivals that once bound the calendar, Saturnalia, Lupercalia, the games of Mars, faded into memory. The theatres grew quiet. The temples emptied. Statues of gods were toppled or rededicated to saints. The empire's imagination changed direction, from the glory of the world to the promise of heaven. The old virtues, courage, ambition, victory, were replaced by humility, mercy, and faith. To many Romans, this new moral order felt strange. It asked them to turn away from the pride that had built their world. It told them that the empire itself was only temporary, that a greater kingdom waited beyond the grave. For some, this was comfort. For others, betrayal. By the late 4th century, Christianity had become not just tolerated, but official. Emperor Theodosius declared it the only true faith of the empire. The temples of the old gods were closed, their rituals banned. Priests of Jupiter and Venus were dismissed. Those who refused conversion were quietly pushed aside. The world that had once welcomed every god now allowed only one. And in that exclusivity, the empire found both strength and fracture. The new faith united the empire under a shared creed, but it also gave people something more dangerous than obedience: conviction. Men and women now argued not over laws or taxes, but over the nature of God. Councils were called to settle questions no sword could answer. Was Christ divine, human, or both? How many natures could one Savior have? Each answer created another schism, each creed another heresy. Even faith, it seemed, could divide. In the East, theology became an art, debated in churches, refined by scholars, preserved in texts. Bishops wielded influence equal to generals. Constantinople, the new heart of empire, gleamed with mosaics and sermons. The faith there was learned, structured, imperial. In the West, it was simpler, rougher, closer to the soil. Faith was comfort for farmers, for soldiers, for the poor. Its Latin prayers were shorter, its churches plainer. The East argued over doctrine. The West simply believed. The divide that had begun as geography was now becoming spiritual. Even the role of the emperor changed. Under the old gods, the emperor had been divine, a living bridge between heaven and earth. Under Christianity, he was mortal again, a servant of God rather than a god himself. This humbled the throne, but it also limited its authority. The emperor now shared his power with bishops, councils, and the church. Rome no longer ruled alone. The church became a second empire, invisible but everywhere. In the cities of the West, bishops began to replace governors as figures of authority. When the state could no longer feed the hungry or protect the poor, the church did. When imperial officials vanished, priests remained. Charity replaced taxation. Mercy replaced law. In this way, Christianity quietly absorbed the functions of empire, and when the empire finally fell, the church would still stand. But not all welcomed this new world. Among the older families, the memory of the old gods lingered like smoke. Some still kept shrines in hidden rooms. Some still whispered prayers to Jupiter when no one was listening. They looked upon the rising crosses and saw not salvation, but loss, the erasure of 1,000 years of tradition. For them, the empire's conversion was not rebirth, it was surrender. They had built their lives upon the favor of Rome's gods. Without them, they felt adrift. Even the philosophers struggled to adapt. The schools of Athens and Alexandria still taught Plato and Aristotle, still spoke of reason and virtue. But their students were fewer now. Their works were read through the lens of faith. Logic became the servant of theology. The mind of Rome was changing, from inquiry to devotion, from curiosity to obedience. And yet, in its gentleness, Christianity softened the world it conquered. The gladiatorial games ended. Slavery, though not abolished, was slowly questioned. The value of compassion, once dismissed as weakness, became the empire's new ideal. In its final centuries, Rome learned kindness, but too late to save itself. The shift in faith also shifted loyalty. For the first time, a citizen could feel more allegiance to the church than to the emperor. The state had ruled men's bodies. The church now ruled their souls. When emperors died, new ones rose. But the bishops remained. Their power outlasted dynasties. In time, it would outlast the empire itself. And as the church grew in influence, it also grew in wealth. Land, donations, relics, all flowed into its hands. Great basilicas rose where temples had stood. The church became landlord, judge, and teacher. In many places, it was the government. The empire had built roads. The church now filled them with pilgrims. The empire had enforced law. The church now preached conscience. The world had not ended. It had simply changed owners. But faith, for all its beauty, did not heal the empire's wounds. While the church tended souls, the borders crumbled. While bishops debated doctrine, legions went unpaid. While gold was spent on cathedrals, fortresses decayed. Heaven grew brighter, earth grew weaker. The empire found peace in faith, but lost itself in the process. Still, there was hope. Many believed that God had chosen Rome as his instrument, that the same empire which once spread conquest would now spread salvation. The old roads that once carried soldiers now carried missionaries. The Latin tongue, once the language of war, became the language of Scripture. Even in decline, Rome carried its message across the world. It was no longer the empire of the sword. It was becoming the empire of the soul. By the late 4th century, the Christian world had fully taken root. Crosses gleamed from church, towers. Monks copied scripture by candlelight. Families baptized their children with names like Peter and Paul. The old gods, once mighty, were now myths, half-remembered stories told by scholars and poets. But not everyone felt peace. In the East, theology had become a battlefield. In the West, faith had become a refuge from fear. Rome had gained a heaven and lost its balance. In Constantinople, the union of throne and altar made the emperor seem chosen again, not divine, but ordained. In the West, where the state weakened, the church filled the silence with prayer, and so the divide widened. One half guided by empire, the other by faith. Religion had once united the Roman world. Now it mirrored its fractures. And though no one could see it yet, this new spiritual empire, patient, eternal, unseen, would soon outlive the marble one. The crumbling foundations. An empire does not collapse in a single day. It wears down, like stone in the rain, like iron in the salt air, slowly, patiently, invisibly. The Roman world still calls itself eternal, but its foundation stones are beginning to crack. Not in the palaces or temples, those will crumble last, but in the fields, the markets, and the hearts of ordinary people. The rot begins where the empire breathes. For centuries, Rome's strength came not only from its armies, but from its soil. Wheat from North Africa, olives from Spain, wine from Gaul, grain from the valleys of the Tiber, all of it bound together by roads and rivers, ships and trade. But now the fields lie tired, the roads crumble, the ships grow fewer. Years of overuse, mismanagement and taxation have drained the land and the people alike. The farmers who once fed the empire can no longer feed themselves. In the beginning, Roman citizenship was a gift. It meant protection, status, belonging. But by the 5th century, it had become a burden. To be a Roman was to pay taxes you could not afford, obey laws you did not respect, and serve an emperor you would never meet. And so, little by little, people began to slip away from the cities, from the bureaucracy, from the empire itself. They fled to the countryside, to the estates of powerful landowners who offered safety in exchange for labor. There, they became colony, tenant farmers bound to the land. Not slaves, but not free either. The empire still called them citizens. In truth, they were peasants living under new masters. As the countryside emptied into estates, the empire's heart, its cities, began to fade. The forums grew silent. The baths cooled. The theatres closed. The once bustling marketplaces became ghostly at dusk. The marble still stood, but it was chipped and repurposed. Statues of emperors were melted down to pay soldiers. Stones from temples were carried away to build walls and barns. Cities that had once pulsed with the rhythm of empire now lived at the edge of ruin, half inhabited, half memory. In Gaul, entire towns were abandoned. In Britain, Roman villas were swallowed by grass. Even Rome itself, the capital of the ancient world, began to empty. The population that once numbered over 1 million now fell to a fraction of that. The great avenues grew wild with weeds. Goats grazed where senators once walked. The eternal city was becoming a monument to what had been. The decline of trade deepened the decay. For centuries, the empire had been tied together by the Mediterranean, its mare nostrum, our sea. Roman ships had once crossed it daily, bringing goods and ideas from every corner of the world. But with the loss of provinces, piracy, and endless war, that flow faltered. Merchants stopped sailing. Caravans stopped crossing. Without trade, taxes dried up. Without taxes, soldiers went unpaid. Without soldiers, provinces broke away. The machine that had once run so smoothly began to grind itself apart. In the West, money itself began to lose meaning. Silver became scarce. Gold was hoarded by the wealthy. Coins grew smaller, lighter, thinner. Barter replaced currency. A sack of grain was worth more than a handful of coins. A good ox could buy what money could not. The empire that had invented monetary order now lived on trade of need and trust. It is hard to feel eternal when your empire runs on IOUs. And yet, for all its decay, the bureaucracy survived. The imperial administration, endless and hungry, continued to function. Governors demanded taxes from lands that could not pay. Clerks recorded decrees for citizens who no longer existed. Edicts were issued, copied, and ignored. Rome's laws outlived Rome's life. The government became a ghost, existing more on parchment than in reality. In the east, Constantinople thrived. Its harbors were full, its markets rich, its officials competent. Gold flowed from Egypt and Asia. The city gleamed with mosaics and marble. But in the west, the contrast was painful. Ravenna, the new western capital, was chosen for its swamps and safety rather than its splendor. Its walls were strong, but its soul was thin. The emperors who ruled from there were more caretakers than conquerors, men presiding over a slow disassembly. They still wore purple, still signed decrees, still sent ambassadors to the east. But their armies were smaller, their reach shorter, their hope fainter. The empire had not fallen, it had sunk. The people adapted as people always do. In the countryside, they turned to barter, to family, to faith. They grew what they needed, traded what they could, and prayed for protection from whatever lay beyond the horizon. Local leaders, landlords, bishops, warlords became the new faces of power. To them, the emperor was a distant rumor. The empire still existed, but for most, it had become irrelevant. You could live and die under Roman rule without ever seeing a soldier, paying a tax, or hearing a law. Rome had become an idea, something remembered, not experienced. The slow decline bred something worse than rebellion, indifference. When the empire had been strong, its people had feared its fall. Now they barely noticed it. The loyalty that once united provinces in pride had been replaced by a quiet, practical disinterest. The people did not hate Rome. They simply stopped believing in it. In its place, they believed in what they could see: the church, the land, the village, the family. The world was shrinking, one heart at a time. Even the army, once Rome's pride, had changed beyond recognition. The legions of old, disciplined, loyal, and Roman to the core, were gone. In their place were mercenaries and foederati, hired from tribes beyond the frontiers. They fought bravely, but not for Rome. They fought for pay, for land, for survival. Their leaders were generals with foreign names and local ambitions, men like Stilicho, Ricimer, and Aetius, half Roman, half barbarian, serving an empire that needed them, but no longer trusted them. When such men won victories, they became indispensable. When they failed, they were executed. The empire devoured its saviors one by one. In the streets of Rome, the signs of decay were everywhere. The aqueducts still stood, but fewer engineers knew how to repair them. The public baths were closing. The fountains trickled weakly. Citizens, once proud of their city's grandeur, now lived among ruins without shame or wonder. The past was too large to mourn. Even the senators who remained had grown detached. Their wealth came not from the empire, but from their estates. They served the emperor out of habit, not loyalty. The idea of Rome had outlasted the will to maintain it. Sometimes decline comes not from defeat, but from weariness. The empire had survived too much. Too many wars, too many reforms, too many emperors. Each crisis left it weaker, more brittle, less capable of renewal. It still looked like Rome, it still spoke Latin, but it had lost the energy that once filled its temples and armies. The empire was not being conquered, it was being forgotten. In the East, scholars wrote new laws. Bishops debated doctrine. Artists built churches of breathtaking beauty. In the West, peasants prayed for rain. Two halves of a single world, moving in opposite directions. The Eastern Empire looked toward the future. The Western Empire looked at the ground. And yet, for all its loss, the West was not without dignity. Its people were poor, but not broken. Its faith was deep, its traditions strong. The Latin tongue still bound its provinces. The law still echoed in its courts. Even as the empire decayed, its culture endured, like embers glowing faintly after the fire has gone out. In time, those embers would light new worlds. But for now, the night deepened. The empire had built walls, but it could not rebuild itself. It had taught order to the world, but it could no longer impose it. Its strength had become memory, and its memory was all that held it together. Rome, the eternal, was not eternal after all. But it would not end with a cry. It would end with a sigh, drawn out over decades, whispered across a fading world. The marble crumbles, the coins rust, the records fade, but the idea lingers, carried by those who will not let it die. The barbarians within. They do not come with fire and fury. Not yet. They come in silence, across rivers, through forests, following the same roads once paved by Roman hands. Families, not armies. Carts, not catapults. They come with children, with livestock, with hope. They are called barbarians. To the Romans, the word means everyone beyond the walls. Anyone who does not speak Latin or Greek. Anyone who lives without the empire's laws. It means the foreign, the unshaped, the untamed. But the truth is more complicated. By the 5th century, the barbarians are no longer strangers. They are part of Rome itself. For generations, Rome had recruited from its frontiers. The empire's armies, once proudly Roman, had grown dependent on outsiders. Goths, Franks, Vandals, Burgundians, Huns, names that would one day fill history's pages with dread, now filled its ranks. They fought Rome's wars, guarded its borders, and served its emperors. Some rose high, commanding entire armies. It was a practical arrangement. The empire needed soldiers, the tribes needed land and pay, and for a while, it worked. Rome had turned enemies into allies, not through conquest, but through contract. The arrangement had a name, foederati. These were tribes granted land within the empire's borders in exchange for military service. They built villages, tilled Roman soil, and pledged loyalty to the emperor. But loyalty bought with land is a fragile thing. When payments stopped, when promises were broken, that loyalty turned quickly to resentment, and resentment, given an army, becomes danger. At first, the Romans believed they could absorb everyone. They always had before. The Gauls, the Spaniards, the Greeks, all had become Roman in time. The empire's genius was its ability to transform. It conquered, but it also included. It offered citizenship, law, and status to those who joined it. The empire's doors were never fully closed. But now, the influx was different, faster, larger, less controlled. Entire peoples were crossing the frontiers, not as subjects, but as nations seeking refuge. The empire's walls were no longer lines of defense. They were invitations. The first great wave came from the north and east. Pressured by the Huns, fierce horsemen sweeping out of the Eurasian steppe, the Gothic tribes fled westward. In 376 AD, tens of thousands of them reached the banks of the Danube, begging the Romans for sanctuary. The Emperor Valens, ruling from Constantinople, allowed them to cross. It was a decision made from mercy, or perhaps necessity. The empire needed soldiers. The Goths needed safety. But poor management and corruption turned a moment of diplomacy into disaster. Roman. Officials mistreated the refugees, extorted them, starved them. The Goths revolted. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, they destroyed a Roman army and killed the emperor himself. It was the first time in centuries that Rome had lost an emperor in battle to foreign foes. And it was a warning that no one heard. After Adrianople, the relationship between Rome and the barbarians changed forever. They were no longer just auxiliaries, they were power brokers. Generals of Gothic or Vandal blood now commanded Roman troops. Tribes negotiated not from fear, but from leverage. The empire, desperate for soldiers, gave them more land, more autonomy, more control. Rome had once conquered the world, with discipline. Now it bargained with the world for survival. In the West, this dependence deepened. By the 5th century, the Western Empire could no longer field armies without barbarian help. Entire provinces were defended by foreign mercenaries, men loyal only to their chieftains. Some of these leaders served Rome faithfully. Stilicho, half Roman and half Vandal, saved Italy from invasion more than once. Others, like Ricimer, became kingmakers, commanding the army, deposing emperors, ruling from behind the throne. The emperors still wore the purple robe, but the real power belonged to the generals. And the generals were no longer Roman. The lines between Rome and the barbarians blurred. Many took Roman titles, adopted Roman dress, and minted coins bearing their names beside the emperors. They called themselves magistri militum, masters of soldiers. They married Roman women, baptized their children, and built villas that looked more Roman than the ones in Italy. They spoke Latin, they quoted scripture, they sat in the Senate. To the people, they seemed Roman enough, but their loyalty remained tribal. When the empire faltered, they followed their own. The presence of the barbarians changed more than the army. It changed the idea of what Rome meant. For centuries, Rome had been both place and identity, a way of life that stretched across the known world. But now, that identity was being rewritten. To be Roman was no longer about birth or citizenship. It was about usefulness, about whether you could serve the empire's needs. The title of Roman had once been a crown. Now it was a uniform. The empire began to fragment from within. Each region, Gaul, Hispania, Africa, had its own barbarian allies, its own armies, its own power structures. The emperor ruled in name, but in practice, every province answered to its own protector. Some tribes remained loyal, others grew restless, and some, like the Visigoths under Alaric, began to dream of more than service. They wanted a place of their own. Alaric had once been a Roman soldier. He had fought in the empire's wars, bled for its victories, and been denied his reward. In his frustration, he turned his army toward the heart of the empire. In 410 AD, after years of negotiation and betrayal, Alaric and his men entered Rome itself. For 3 days, the eternal city, untouched for 8 centuries, was plundered by those who had once fought to protect it. They did not burn it to the ground. They looted. They took what they needed. And then they left. The sack of Rome was more symbolic than physical. The city still stood, but the illusion of invincibility did not. For the first time, the Romans understood that the barbarians were not outside their world. They were their world. In the aftermath, the empire's identity continued to blur. Children of mixed heritage, Roman fathers, Gothic mothers, filled the courts and armies. Latin mixed with Germanic dialects. The empire was no longer purely Roman, nor entirely foreign. It was something new, a mosaic of cultures held together by habit and nostalgia. Rome had always absorbed its enemies, but this time it was being absorbed in return. In the East, Constantinople managed this transformation with grace. The emperors there made allies of the tribes, settled them carefully, used them wisely. In the West, where power was thinner and money scarcer, the process was clumsy and desperate. Whole regions were handed over in exchange for peace. In Gaul, the Franks gained lands. In Spain, the Visigoths. In North Africa, the Vandals. Each treaty was meant to buy time. Each treaty surrendered more control. The empire was trading land for life, a few more years, a few more breaths. The barbarians were no longer guests. They were neighbors, then partners, then masters. Rome had not fallen to an invasion. It had been hollowed out from within. The men who now ruled in its name had Roman titles, Roman coins, Roman robes, but their loyalty was to themselves. When the last emperor finally fell, it would not be to foreign swords, but to familiar hands. And yet, even as the empire decayed, the idea of Rome remained powerful. To the tribes, Rome was still civilization, a model to imitate. They adopted its laws, its language, its religion. They ruled as kings, but called themselves patricians. They built kingdoms, but still minted coins with Roman emperors on one side and their own faces on the other. They destroyed Rome and then tried to become it. For ordinary people, little changed at first. Taxes were still collected, laws were still read, priests still preached. But behind the scenes, the empire's command structure had dissolved. The emperor's writ no longer reached the provinces. The generals ruled like local kings. It was no longer an empire in any real sense, just a memory, a story people told themselves to explain why the world still functioned. Civilizations rarely see their own endings. To the people of the 5th century, life went on. The seasons turned. Children were born. Markets opened and closed. But history was already changing shape. The Roman world, that vast web of cities, soldiers, and citizens, was dissolving into something new. The borders between Roman and barbarian had vanished. And when a boundary disappears, so does the thing it was meant to protect. Rome's last strength had been its ability to absorb others. But what happens when there is no Rome left to do the absorbing? The answer was beginning to unfold, quietly, in the heart of the empire itself. The Huns and the breaking of the frontiers. In the long memory of Rome, the frontiers had always felt eternal. They were the edges of the known world, lines drawn in rivers and forests, patrolled by legions, fortified by stone, held by discipline. The Rhine, the Danube, the Alps, the deserts of Africa, these were the empire's skin, the walls that kept chaos at bay. But in the 5th century, those lines began to breathe, and then they began to break. The world beyond Rome was shifting, tribes on the move, lands in motion. It began far away, in the vast grasslands of Central Asia, where the wind runs unbroken for thousands of miles. There, a people rode whose name would come to terrify the West, the Huns. They were horsemen unlike any Rome had known, small, swift, relentless. They lived on horseback, fought on horseback, and seemed to belong more to the horizon than to the earth. No walls could hold them, no treaty could bind them. They moved like weather, sudden, unpredictable, unstoppable. Where they rode, the world changed. The Huns drove westward, pressing other tribes before them, like waves before a storm. The Alans, the Goths, the Vandals, all displaced, all seeking refuge inside the Roman world. Rome had once been a fortress. Now it was becoming a shelter. Tens of thousands crossed the rivers, bringing families, wagons, animals. Not armies, but nations. To the Romans, it looked like invasion. To the refugees, it was survival. And so began the Great Migrations, a movement of peoples that would redraw the map of Europe forever. The empire was not prepared. Its legions were scattered, its coffers empty, its unity gone. Frontiers that had stood for centuries were suddenly open. Commanders sent letters for reinforcements that never came. In some regions, Roman officials allowed the tribes to settle, hoping to turn them into allies. In others, they tried to resist and failed. One by one, the provinces began to slip away. Gaul, once the jewel of the western provinces, became a patchwork of Roman towns and barbarian camps. Spain filled with Visigoths and Suebi. North Africa would soon be lost to the Vandals. The frontiers no longer marked where Rome ended. They marked where it used to be. The Huns themselves did not seek empire. They were not builders, not governors, not lawmakers. They were pressure, the kind that collapses what is already weak. When they came to the borders, they demanded tribute. When it was not paid, they destroyed. Cities burned, fields emptied. Entire populations fled southward, searching for safety that no longer existed. And yet, the Huns were not devils. They were part of the same world, drawn by the same hunger, for land, for wealth, for belonging. Rome had once expanded for those same reasons. Now, others were doing the same, only in reverse. History had turned inside out. At the heart of this storm was one man, Attila. He rose from obscurity to unite the Huns under a single banner, a rare feat among nomads. To his enemies, he was the scourge of God. To his followers, a leader of cunning and charisma. Attila understood both fear and diplomacy. He made treaties with Constantinople, accepted gifts from Ravenna, and played one half of the empire against the other. His power came not from territory, but from movement. He was everywhere and nowhere. To the Romans, this was madness. To Attila, it was freedom. In 447, he swept through the Balkans. Cities that had stood since the time of Alexander fell to ash. Constantinople itself trembled. The emperor paid him gold, so much gold that it hollowed the treasury, in exchange for peace. Peace, however, was only ever a pause. In the west, Attila turned his gaze toward Gaul. There, he met resistance. The Roman general Aetius, himself half barbarian, forged an uneasy alliance with the Visigoths, Franks, and Burgundians. Together, they faced Attila on the plains of northern France. The battle was brutal, the outcome uncertain. But Attila withdrew, not defeated, merely uninterested. He had tested the West and found it dying. He would return the following year. In 452, Attila invaded Italy. The northern cities burned. Refugees fled southward. The Emperor Valentinian III hid behind the marshes of Ravenna. Rome itself waited in terror, but the city was spared, not by armies, but by words. A delegation led by Pope Leo X met Attila on the banks of the Mincio River. What was said between them is lost to history. Some claim divine intervention, others diplomacy. Whatever the reason, Attila turned away. The eternal city was saved, for now. A year later, Attila was dead. The storm had passed, but the damage remained. The invasions of the Huns did not destroy the empire directly. They destroyed its borders, the invisible confidence that had once kept Rome whole. After Attila's death, his vast horde disintegrated, scattering back into tribes. But the lands they had shaken never settled again. The people displaced by the Huns, Goths, Vandals, Franks, remained inside the empire, carving out kingdoms of their own. The frontiers that once defined civilization were gone, replaced by a mosaic of competing powers. Rome's map had blurred beyond recognition. In the east, Constantinople recovered. Its walls held, its treasury refilled, its institutions endured. But in the west, there was no recovery. The damage was too deep, the population too reduced, the faith in Rome too faint. The invasions had not merely taken land, they had taken meaning. For centuries, the empire had defined itself as the barrier between civilization and chaos. Now, the two had merged. There was no outside anymore, only the slow, quiet realization that the empire was no longer the center of the world. Life went on, as it always does. In Italy, farmers rebuilt. In Gaul, villages grew beside the ruins of Roman forts. In Africa, markets reopened under new rulers. The world was not ending, only changing hands. But to the Romans who remembered the past, it felt like loss. The boundaries that had once given them identity had vanished. The word Roman no longer described a people or a place. It described a memory. The empire had once tamed the world beyond the frontier. Now, that world had come home. Barbarians no longer lived in forests and tents. They lived in villas, commanded armies, and wore the same robes as senators. Rome had spent centuries civilizing its enemies. It had succeeded too well. The invasions did not mark the fall of Rome. They marked its transformation. The legions were gone, but their tactics lived on. The Latin tongue was fading, but its children, French, Spanish, Italian, were being born. The empire's body was dying, but its spirit was dividing and multiplying. The fall was not destruction, it was diffusion. Rome did not vanish, it dissolved into everything around it. When historians speak of the 5th century, they often call it the Age of Migrations, a phrase that sounds violent, but was, in truth, profoundly human. People were moving, searching, surviving. Tribes became kingdoms. Frontiers became homelands. It was the end of one world and the quiet birth of another. In the decades that followed, Rome would never again control its borders. The Rhine and the Danube, once patrolled by legions, became lines on forgotten maps. The Mediterranean, once Rome's lake, was now a patchwork of pirate coves and petty ports. And yet, the empire endured in habit. The officials still wrote in Latin. The bishops still prayed in Roman churches. The peasants still called their land Imperium. Even as the world changed, the name remained. The empire had become an echo, faint but unbroken. The Huns had been a storm, brief, terrible, cleansing. They had torn apart the borders that Rome no longer had the strength to defend. And when the clouds cleared, the old world was gone. In its place stood something less ordered but more alive, a landscape of new peoples, new tongues, new faiths. Rome's walls had fallen, but its ideas had spread like dust on the wind. Empires end as they began, with movement. The same roads that once carried legions now carried migrants. The same ships that once sailed for conquest now sailed for survival. And in that endless motion, the identity of Rome, so firm, so certain, was carried outward, piece by piece, until it belonged to everyone. The frontiers had broken, but the world, somehow, continued. The sack of Rome. It begins, as endings often do, in disbelief. For centuries, the city of Rome had lived with the quiet certainty of eternity. Wars came and went. Emperors rose and fell. Plagues, famines, rebellions, all were temporary storms. Rome endured them all. The thought that it could ever be touched, truly touched, was unthinkable. And yet, one summer morning in the year 410, the unthinkable happened. The eternal city was breached. The Goths had come to the gates before. Led by Alaric, once a Roman general, they had marched across Italy for years, demanding land, pay, and recognition. Rome had negotiated, delayed, betrayed, and pleaded. Promises were made and broken, as they always were. Gold was sent, then withheld. Armies were raised, then recalled. The empire's will was fractured, its leadership divided. At last, the patience of the Goths ran out. In August of that year, they surrounded the city once more. Rome's walls were strong, its heart was weak. The siege was slow and silent. No catapults, no grand assaults, just hunger. Grain stores dwindled, water ran foul, disease crept through the alleys. The people prayed, to Christ, to saints, to any god who might still be listening. Some whispered of the old gods, wondering if their abandonment had brought this curse. Inside the walls, time stretched, days blurred, hope withered. And then, one night, a gate opened. No one is sure how. Perhaps treachery, perhaps mercy. But the Goths entered. There was no great battle, no army waiting to defend the city. Only silence, then the sound of boots on marble. The eternal city, once the ruler of the known world, was at the mercy of men who had once been its subjects. Alaric's soldiers moved through the streets in the pale light of dawn. They broke open storehouses, took food, gold, and wine. They entered homes, temples, and palaces. There was looting, yes, but not slaughter. The Goths were not there to destroy Rome. They were there to feed on its remains. In the great basilicas, terrified citizens took refuge. Many fled to the Church of St. Peter, carrying what little they could, jewelry, icons, family relics, clinging to the hope that holy ground would offer safety. And it did. Alaric's men, though hungry and desperate, respected the churches. The faith of the new world restrained the fury of the old. In that strange mercy, something shifted. The conquerors had taken the city, but the city had converted the conquerors. For 3 days, Rome was theirs. 3 days of noise and fire, of doors broken, of statues toppled. 3 days of disbelief, of tears, of whispered prayers. And then, as suddenly as they had come, the Goths left. They took their spoils, gold, grain, captives, and marched south toward the sea. Alaric intended to sail to Africa, but the winds turned against him. Before he could try again, he died, a conqueror for less than a year. He was buried, legend says, in a riverbed, the waters diverted to hide his grave. When the river flowed again, no one remembered where. The sack itself was brief. The damage, compared to later disasters, was small, but its meaning was immeasurable. For the first time in 800 years, the walls of Rome had been breached by foreign hands. The unbroken spell of eternity had shattered. The world's greatest city had learned that it could fall. Across the empire, the news spread like shock. In Constantinople, senators wept openly. In North Africa, bishops despaired. In Gaul, peasants whispered that the world was ending. The poet Jerome, hearing of it in Bethlehem, wrote, "The light of the world has gone out." For 1,000 years, Rome had been more than a city. It had been the axis of civilization, the place where history itself seemed to stand still. Now, it was just another city, fallen to the same fate as the rest. To the Romans who lived through it, the sack felt apocalyptic. Not because of what was lost, but because of what it meant. If Rome could fall, then nothing was safe. The temples were empty, the Senate powerless, the emperor absent. Even the gods, old and new alike, seemed silent. The people wandered through their streets after the Goths departed, stepping over rubble and ashes, and realized the truth that no one wanted to say aloud. The empire no longer protected them. Yet, even in that realization, life persisted. The city was not destroyed. The aqueducts still ran. The markets reopened. Priests resumed their prayers. Rome, in its own way, refused to die. But something within it, some invisible core of confidence, was gone forever. The philosophers of the time tried to make sense of it. Pagans said the fall had come because Rome had abandoned the old gods. Christians said it had come because Rome had grown proud. Both were wrong, and both were right. Empires do not fall for one reason. They fall because too many threads break at once. And by 410, there were few left to hold. The sack of Rome did not end the empire, but it ended the illusion of its eternity. The emperors who ruled afterward would never again claim the same authority. The idea of the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, was gone, replaced by something fragile and fearful. The empire still existed, but it now knew its own mortality. After Alaric's death, his people continued southward, searching for a place to settle. They found it years later, in southern Gaul and Spain, where they became the Visigoths. They built towns, minted coins, raised churches. In time, they called themselves Romans too. The conquerors had inherited what they conquered. That was Rome's strange gift. Even in defeat, it transformed those who touched it. For the people who remained in Rome, the years after the sack were quiet. They rebuilt slowly, stone by stone, market by market. But the city was smaller now, poorer, emptier. The Senate continued to meet, though its power was ceremonial. The emperors still issued decrees, though few obeyed them. Rome was no longer the center of empire. It was the shadow of one. But shadows linger. The memory of empire still shaped the world, in law, in faith, in language. Even as Rome crumbled, its essence spread outward, invisible and enduring. The barbarians could take its stones, its gold, its walls, but not its idea. That idea would outlive them all. In later centuries, many would look back on the sack as the beginning of the Dark Ages, the night that fell over Europe. But perhaps it was not a night at all. Perhaps it was a long twilight, dim, uncertain, but full of quiet life. In the ruins of the old world, new worlds were already growing. Children born in those years would never know the Rome that had ruled the earth, but they would carry its echoes in their speech, their laws, their faith. The empire was gone. Its reflection remained. History would remember the sack of Rome as a fall, but maybe it was something softer, a letting go. For centuries, Rome had carried the weight of the world on its shoulders. Now, finally, it had set it down. The city that had once ruled continents had become what it had always been underneath, a collection of streets, people, prayers, and memories. It was smaller, but it was still Rome. And sometimes, that is how greatness survives, not in conquest, but in endurance. The empire in fragments. After the sack of 410, the empire did not end. It lingered, not with strength or triumph, but with habit, the slow continuation of what had always been. Rome had been wounded, not killed. It still had emperors, armies, and laws. But the pulse that once beat across continents now flickered in fragments. The great unity of the Roman world, one language, one law, one horizon, had been broken into pieces, like pottery scattered on a cold floor. Each fragment still glinted faintly with the light of empire. Each believed itself the last true peace. The world after the sack was not one of chaos, but of silence. The great machine of Rome continued to turn, but its gears no longer meshed. Governors still wrote to the emperor, but their letters arrived to find a throne already empty. Orders were sent to provinces that no longer existed. Armies marched without knowing who they fought for. In the east, Constantinople continued, bright, confident, alive. In the west, the empire had become a memory, trying to remember itself. The frontiers, once defined by rivers and fortresses, had vanished. Now, the empire's borders were wherever someone still claimed to serve it. In Gaul, Roman generals ruled cities like kings. In Spain, governors became lords of the land. In Britain, the legions had sailed away, leaving behind villas that crumbled into fields. Rome's reach had never been shorter. Britain had been one of the first to go. For centuries, it had been the empire's misty edge, a land of soldiers, miners, and merchants. The Roman roads had cut straight across its hills, its cities filled with Latin speech. But when the legions were recalled to defend Italy, they never returned. The walls decayed, the towns emptied, the villas fell to ruin. The people, once proud citizens of Rome, turned to their own defences, warlords, militias, local councils. In time, new tribes would come, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, carrying with them the seeds of new kingdoms. But for now, Britain was a ghost of the empire. In Gaul, the pattern was slower. Roman culture remained strong. The villas still worked, the churches thrived, the towns still bore Latin names. But beyond the cities, the countryside belonged to others. The Franks and Burgundians settled along the rivers. The Visigoths held the south. The Roman administration pretended to govern them, sending edicts that no one enforced. In truth, Gaul had become a tapestry of overlapping loyalties. Half Roman, half barbarian, entirely uncertain. Spain, too, had changed hands. Once a rich and peaceful province, it now belonged to the Visigoths. They ruled from Toledo, issuing decrees in Latin, praying in Roman churches, and wearing Roman robes. But they were not Romans. They were something new, inheritors of Rome's shadow. And across the sea, in North Africa, another story unfolded. Carthage, Rome's old rival, once burned to the ground, had been reborn as one of its richest provinces. Its fields fed the empire. Its ports filled the treasury. But in 429, the Vandals crossed from Spain. Led by their king Genseric, they moved swiftly and ruthlessly, taking city after city until Africa was theirs. The Romans sent armies to stop them. They failed. By 439, the Vandals ruled the region completely, including Carthage itself. It was a quiet irony. The city Rome had destroyed had outlived it. The loss of Africa was more than symbolic. It was fatal. Without African grain, Italy began to starve. The supply routes that had fed the capital for centuries were gone. Bread became rare, gold became meaningless. The heart of the empire was now hungry, and hunger, more than any enemy, can end a world. Italy itself survived, but only barely. The emperors no longer ruled from Rome. The city had become too vulnerable, too exposed. Instead, they governed from Ravenna, a fortress city built among marshes, surrounded by water and mist. It was safe, yes, but it was also isolated. Ravenna was a capital without citizens, an empire without a people. There, emperors reigned like echoes, shadows of men who had once commanded legions and nations. They still wore the purple robe. They still signed decrees. But the world outside their walls no longer listened. The Senate remained in Rome, stubbornly maintaining its rituals. Old families gathered in crumbling villas, debating taxes no one paid, laws no one enforced. They still called themselves Romans. They still believed they governed the world. But their world had shrunk to a handful of districts and dreams. And yet, in the midst of decay, there was continuity. The church filled the gaps the state had left behind. Bishops became judges, monks became scribes, priests became the voice of authority in towns that no longer saw imperial officials. Faith replaced law. The empire's roads still led to Rome, but now they led to St. Peter's tomb instead of the emperor's palace. A new kind of Rome was forming, spiritual, not political. The people too adapted. They planted their fields, repaired their roofs, baptized their children. They no longer expected armies to protect them or governors to help them. They looked to their neighbors, their priests, their lords. The great empire that had once organized every detail of life now existed only in memory. But life went on, smaller, harder, but still life. The fragmentation of the empire was not an explosion. It was an erosion. Each province drifted away slowly, as if carried downstream by a quiet current. No one declared independence. No one proclaimed the end. They simply stopped looking to Rome for answers. And one by one, the provinces became worlds of their own. Even within Italy, Rome's influence was uncertain. The countryside belonged to local magnates who kept private armies. The roads were unsafe. The fields went untilled. And yet, the people still used Roman coins, even when they were centuries old. They still spoke Latin, though it was changing, growing softer, looser, shaped by local tongues. From that broken Latin, new languages were being born. The empire had not just ruled Europe, it had seeded it. Everywhere, you could see the traces of what Rome had been. Aqueducts still carrying water, bridges still spanning rivers, walls still standing where no one remembered who built them. The ruins of empire had become part of the landscape. Silent, patient, beautiful. To live in the 5th century was to live among ghosts, and yet even ghosts can guide the living. The new kingdoms that rose from Rome's ruins imitated what they replaced. The Visigoths issued Roman-style laws. The Vandals ruled from Roman palaces. The Franks kept the Roman calendar. None of them sought to destroy Rome's memory. They sought to inherit it. They saw themselves not as Rome's enemies, but as its heirs. In that way, the empire never truly ended. It simply spread itself thin, living on in the very people who had once been called its foes. For those who remembered the old days, the pain was in the comparison. They could still recall the legions on parade, the grain ships on the Tiber, the festivals in the Forum. Now they saw only ruins and weeds. But for the young, there was no loss. Only the world as it was. They had never seen an emperor in his glory. To them, the crumbling walls were not tragedy. They were home. The empire was in fragments, but those fragments were alive. Each piece, Gaul, Spain, Africa, Italy, carried something of Rome within it. Its roads, its laws, its faith, its dreams. The whole was gone, but the parts endured. And sometimes endurance is a kind of victory. In time, the world would look back and name this era a fall. But the people who lived through it did not see an ending. They saw a change they could not fully understand. To them, the empire still existed, somewhere, somehow. Because how could something so ancient, so vast, simply stop being? They did not yet know that history has many ways of dying, and some of them are gentle. The last emperors. By the 5th century, the title of emperor had become both a crown and a curse. Once it had meant power, armies, wealth, command over the world. Now it meant survival. The emperors of the late West ruled little more than the memory of an empire. They signed decrees no one obeyed. They issued laws no one read. Their portraits hung in cities they would never visit. They were rulers of ghosts. In Ravenna, the new capital, the court still shimmered with ceremony. The marshes that surrounded it made the city nearly impregnable, a refuge from barbarians and rebellions alike. The palaces were small compared to Rome's, but still gilded, still filled with mosaics and incense. At dusk, the Adriatic light filtered through marble arches. Courtiers moved softly through the halls. Priests murmured prayers in echoing chapels. To those who lived there, it still felt imperial. But the empire they governed was only a fraction of what it had been. The emperors of this twilight age came and went with unsettling speed. Most were chosen not by inheritance or ambition, but by convenience. They were puppets, raised up by generals, discarded when they no longer served a purpose. The true power lay not in the throne, but behind it. One of the first to understand this was Stilicho, a general of mixed Roman and Vandal blood. He ruled in the name of the boy emperor Honorius, guiding the empire through the chaos that followed the sack of Rome. Stilicho was loyal, too loyal perhaps. He fought off invasions, balanced the treasury, and kept the fragments of the West from flying apart. But loyalty was never enough. Suspicion and intrigue consumed him. The emperor, swayed by whispers, had Stilicho executed. With his death, one of the last capable defenders of the empire was lost. The frontiers fell soon after. In the years that followed, the empire's leadership became a carousel of names. Constantius, Valentinian, Avitus, Petronius Maximus, Majorian, Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius. Few would be remembered. Fewer still would die in peace. Some were scholars, some were soldiers, some were simply placeholders, faces stamped on coins that barely circulated. Their reigns were measured not in achievements, but in months. The imperial throne had become a chair in an empty theatre, passed from one actor to the next, while the audience slowly left. Behind the stage, the real directors were the generals, men of mixed heritage, fluent in both Latin and ambition. They commanded the armies, controlled the treasury, and appointed the emperors themselves. Among them, Ricimer stands out, a man of barbarian descent who ruled Italy for more than 15 years without ever calling himself emperor. He chose emperors as one might choose tools. When they disobeyed, he removed them. To many, Ricimer was the true ruler of the West, pragmatic, ruthless, patient. But even he could not restore what was already gone. Each decade brought more fragmentation. Gaul fell to the Visigoths, Spain to the Suebi, Africa to the Vandals. Italy remained, but only as a relic. The empire no longer had provinces to rule, only alliances to manage, taxes to collect, and threats to endure. The sea, once Rome's highway, now belonged to pirates and enemies. Even the grain ships that reached Ravenna came at risk. The emperors began to live like prisoners inside their own palaces, surrounded by fear, ceremony, and whispers. Yet through it all, they kept the rituals alive. Each morning, the imperial court gathered for the salutation, officials bowing, petitions read aloud, decrees signed in elegant Latin script. Messengers arrived from Constantinople, bearing letters sealed in gold. Priests blessed the emperor's meals. Musicians played soft hymns in the evenings. On the surface, it was as if nothing had changed. But behind every gesture lay exhaustion. The empire was acting out the memory of itself, like a man repeating prayers long after faith has faded. By the mid-400s, even the East began to lose patience. The emperors of Constantinople sent aid, advice, and armies, but each effort failed to revive the West. The Byzantine historian Priscus wrote that the Western Empire was a body without breath. It still had form, but no life within it. The East would survive 1,000 more years. The West had only decades left. Then came Majorian, one of the last emperors to truly try. He was brave, intelligent, and reform-minded. He rebuilt the army, restored discipline, and even launched a fleet to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals. For a moment, hope flickered. But the fleet was destroyed by fire. Some say by treachery, others by chance. Without ships, without allies, Majorian's position collapsed. Ricimer, the general who had made him emperor, ordered his arrest and execution. Hope died with him. After Majorian, the empire entered its final act. In 455, the Vandals sailed up the Tiber and sacked Rome again. Unlike the Goths before them, they stripped the city methodically. Gold, silver, statues, treasures from 1,000 years of empire. They even carried away the sacred vessels of the Temple of Jerusalem, once paraded by Titus in triumph. When they were done, Rome was left hollow. The city's population fell again. Its dignity fell with it. Even the word Vandal, once the name of a tribe, would forever after mean destruction. The emperors that followed reigned for months, sometimes weeks. Some were installed by Ricimer, some by the Eastern court. All fell quickly. The empire was now a revolving door of crowns and corpses. When Ricimer himself died in 472, the delicate structure of power he had balanced collapsed entirely. Italy descended into chaos. And then came Orestes, a former secretary in the court of Attila the Hun. He was clever, ambitious, and ruthless. He seized power in Ravenna in 475, dismissing the current emperor and installing his own son, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. He was perhaps 12 years old, a child emperor, ruling over an empire that no longer existed. The name was almost poetic. Romulus, like the city's mythical founder. Augustus, like its first true emperor, the first and the last. History seemed to have folded in on itself, a perfect circle closing with a whisper. Romulus Augustulus never ruled. His father Orestes wielded the real power, commanding what remained of the Roman army. But even that army was now filled with foreign mercenaries, men who demanded land as payment. When Orestes refused, they rebelled. Their leader was a man named Odoacer, a Germanic general who had served under Rome's banners for years. He marched on Ravenna. The city, weary of sieges and lies, opened its gates. Orestes was captured and executed. Odoacer entered the palace and met the boy emperor. He did not kill him. He simply told him to step down. On a quiet day in 476 AD, Romulus Augustulus removed the purple robe and handed the imperial insignia to Odoacer. The regalia, the crown, the scepter, the golden standard, was then sent to Constantinople. It was a gesture of submission and of finality. There would be no more emperors in the West. The Roman Empire, after more than 1,000 years, was finished. But there was no fire, no ruin, no drama, no crowd screaming, no armies clashing, just the sound of footsteps echoing in an empty hall, a boy stepping aside for a soldier, an empire exhaling its last breath in peace. Odoacer did not destroy Rome. He ruled it, wisely, even gently, as king of Italy. He kept the Senate, honored the laws, respected the church. He even minted coins in the name of the emperor in Constantinople. To most people, life changed very little. The empire was gone, but its shadow remained. The same roads, the same cities, the same prayers. Only the illusion of eternity had ended. The last emperors had ruled over the end of a story, one written in marble, carried by legions, and remembered in every stone. They could not save it. No one could. Their power was not to preserve, but to witness. They were the guardians of a sunset, and in their quiet failure, they made way for the dawn of something new. Section 5th. The Fall, 476 AD. There is no thunder, no burning city, no final battle to mark the end. When the Roman Empire falls, it does so almost quietly, like a great tree collapsing in a forest, long since emptied of people. You can only hear it if you listen closely. The year is 476. A small army moves through the marshes of Ravenna. Weary soldiers, half Roman, half German, led by a man named Odoacer. He is not a conqueror in the old sense. He seeks no empire, no crown. He is tired of serving masters who cannot pay. Behind him lies Italy, broken, hungry, and directionless. Ahead of him lies the last emperor, a boy, Romulus Augustulus, barely 12 years old, draped in robes too large for him, crowned with a diadem that no longer shines. He lives in a palace that echoes with emptiness. The courtiers whisper out of habit. The guards stand more from ceremony than duty. The boy emperor spends his days reading, drawing, waiting. He does not know it yet, but he will be the last to hold Rome's crown. Odoacer arrives in the city without resistance. No legions stand in his way. No gates are barred. Ravenna has had enough of war. The citizens watch from behind shuttered windows as the general enters the palace. There are no cries, no cheers, just the sound of rain falling softly on the marble courtyards. Inside, Odoacer walks through the long halls where emperors once held court. Halls now half abandoned, their frescoes fading, their statues chipped by time. He reaches the throne room. And there, waiting, is the boy. What passes between them is not recorded. There are no witnesses who live to tell it. Only a gesture remembered in legend. The child rising from the throne, bowing his head and offering the imperial insignia. The crown, the purple cloak, the golden staff. Symbols of 1,000 years of power, handed over without struggle, without blood. Odoacer takes them gently. Perhaps he bows. Perhaps he speaks softly. Perhaps he says nothing at all. Some endings do not need words. He spares the boy's life. Romulus Augustulus is sent south to live in quiet exile, somewhere on the coast of Campania, in a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples. There, surrounded by olive groves and sea wind, the last emperor of the Western world fades into silence. No one knows when he dies. No one records his burial. The empire ends not with a scream, but with a sigh. Odoacer does not call himself emperor. He has no desire to revive what is already dead. Instead, he sends a letter to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, explaining that the West no longer needs its own ruler. One emperor, he says, is enough for both halves of the world. With that message, he sends the imperial regalia, the diadem, the scepter, the standard of Rome, carried across the sea to the last surviving imperial court. When Zeno receives them, he understands what they mean. The West is finished. The Roman Empire, at least the one that had begun with Augustus and conquered the world, has come to its end. But even now, it does not feel like an ending. Rome is still there. The people still live in its streets. The Senate still meets. The laws are still written in Latin. The world goes on. Only the name has changed. Odoacer rules as King of Italy, not Emperor. He swears nominal loyalty to Constantinople, but governs independently. He repairs roads, pays soldiers, keeps order. He rules with restraint, practical, not grand. To the people, it hardly matters who is in charge. The empire had been gone long before it was declared so. For the first time in over 1,000 years, there is no emperor in the West, no purple robe in Rome, no imperial guards in the Forum, no legions on the frontier. The age of Caesars has ended. and in its place, something smaller, humbler, and more human begins. The senators who remain in Rome continue their routines, meetings, speeches, decrees. They still call themselves patres conscripti, the chosen fathers. They send letters to Constantinople, addressing the Eastern Emperor as if the old hierarchy still exists. But deep down, they know. The world that had defined them, the empire that had made their titles, their wealth, their meaning, is gone. They are caretakers of memory now. The streets of Rome grow quieter each year. The population, once counted in hundreds of thousands, dwindles to tens of thousands. Temples stand roofless. Marble columns lie half buried in grass. The Forum, once a sea of voices, becomes a pasture for goats. And yet, even in its decay, the city retains a strange beauty. It feels eternal, even in ruin, as if the stones themselves remember what they once were. In Constantinople, the news of the West's fall is met not with mourning, but with acceptance. The Eastern court has long known the truth. The emperors there, rich, safe, and distant, already see themselves as the true heirs of Rome. They will continue the legacy for 1,000 years more, calling themselves Basileis Romaion, emperors of the Romans, long after the city that gave the title has turned to dust. To them, Rome has not fallen. It has simply moved east. But in the lands of the Old West, a new world begins to grow. The Gothic kingdoms in Spain, the Frankish tribes in Gaul, the Vandals in Africa, all of them, in their own way, carry pieces of Rome within them, its laws, its faith, its language. The empire has ended, but its shadow has multiplied. Its death is not destruction, it is transformation. The year 476 will later be written as the fall of Rome, but for the people who lived through it, it was just another year. The sun rose, the markets opened, children played in the streets, farmers still plowed their fields, priests still offered prayers. No trumpet sounded, no star fell from the sky. The empire simply slipped beneath the horizon, like the setting sun, fading slowly, leaving behind a glow that would light the world for centuries. The men who chronicled it did not speak of catastrophe. They wrote instead of fatigue, of an age that had grown too heavy to bear its own memory. Rome had lasted longer than anyone had the right to expect. It had built the modern world and then outlived it. Its end was not a failure, it was a fulfillment. The natural stillness that follows a long, exhausting day. And so, the Western Empire passed into history. Its monuments remained, its language endured, its law-shaped kingdoms not yet born. It died, but its body became the soil in which new civilizations would grow. Sometimes, the greatest triumph is simply to endure long enough to be remembered. Rome had conquered with swords, ruled with law, and fallen with grace. And though the empire's banners were lowered, its spirit never truly left. It lived on in every road, every cathedral, every word spoken in its descendants' tongues. The Roman world was gone, but the world it made was only beginning. In the quiet of that final year, as the last emperor vanished into the countryside and the last crown crossed the sea, the eternal city lay beneath the evening sky, silent, broken, timeless. The wind moved through the arches of the Colosseum. The Tiber flowed as it always had, and in the fading light, Rome seemed not dead, but dreaming. The empire is gone, but its sound still lingers, faint, steady, like the memory of a bell that has long since stopped ringing. The world that follows is quieter, darker, smaller. Yet within that silence, something new begins to breathe. For though Rome has fallen, it has not vanished. Its echo fills every corner of the age to come. It begins in the roads, the veins of empire, still stretching across Europe. Built by hands long dead, they remain, straight, unbending, eternal. Merchants, monks, and soldiers walk them now, unaware that their footsteps trace the same paths once followed by legions. The stones remember, even if the people do not. In ruined cities, the walls still stand. Bridges still cross rivers. Aqueducts still carry water. No empire could have lasted forever, but its craftsmanship has. The bones of Rome remain beneath every town, every farm, every field. The medieval world will rise upon these bones, not knowing it still sleeps in the skeleton of something greater. In the language too, Rome lives on. Latin, once the voice of emperors and senators, now belongs to monks and scholars. It becomes the tongue of prayer, of law, of learning. Through it, Rome whispers into the future. Out of Latin will come the languages of Europe, French from Gaul, Spanish from Iberia, Italian from the hills of Rome itself. Even in the mouths of its descendants, the empire continues to speak. In its laws, Rome endures. The idea that justice belongs to all men, that written law is stronger than any ruler. These are Roman ideas. They survive the collapse of cities, the loss of armies, the coming of kings. Centuries later, when Europe begins to rebuild, it will reach back into the ruins and find Roman law waiting, dust-covered but intact. The world will discover that order, once imagined, never fully dies. In its faith too, the empire's spirit remains. Christianity, once a persecuted sect in the shadows of Roman streets, now covers the old world with churches, monasteries, and cathedrals. The cross that once hung in secrecy now crowns the hills. And though the emperors are gone, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, becomes their strange successor, ruling not through armies, but through belief. The empire of the sword becomes the empire of the soul. Even its time endures. The calendar still follows Roman months. The days still bear Roman names. The hours, the seasons, the rhythms of life, all measured by the empire that built them. Every dawn still begins in Latin. Sol rises, luna sets. The world moves on, but the pattern remains. In the east, Constantinople continues. The city shines with domes of gold, its streets alive with scholars and soldiers, its rulers calling themselves emperors of Rome for 1,000 years more. They preserve what the West has lost, its laws, its texts, its sense of order. When the ancient philosophers are rediscovered in the Renaissance, it will be because the East remembered what the West forgot. Rome's ghost walks those halls too. Even in the farthest lands, Rome's memory survives. In Britain, where her legions once marched, peasants plough fields that follow the lines of Roman roads. In Gaul, the language of the empire shapes the new tongues of kings. In Spain, Roman arches still rise over markets and squares. And in Italy, where it all began, the ruins of the empire stand like mountains made by man. People live in their shadow, pray in their shells, and call it home. The empire has ended, but it has never really left. Centuries pass. The world forgets the names of emperors. The legions fade into legend. But the idea remains. The dream of unity, of civilization, of something greater than tribe or king. Every empire that comes after Rome will claim to be its heir. The Franks will call their kingdom the Holy Roman Empire. The Russians will call Moscow the Third Rome. Even the modern world, in its cities and parliaments, still borrows its marble columns and Latin words. Rome is no longer a place. It is an idea. And ideas, unlike cities, do not crumble. They drift, they settle, they take root elsewhere. They change their shape, but not their essence. Rome's greatness was not in conquest or wealth, it was in memory. The ability to build something so vast that it could never be entirely forgotten. Even in failure, it succeeded. The centuries that follow will be called dark. But darkness is only the absence of one light. Rome's fall was not the end of light, only its scattering. The sparks it left behind would kindle new fires across the world. From those fires would rise the nations of Europe, the languages of the West, the laws that still govern lives today. To walk through a European city is to walk through Rome's ghost. Every stone, every street plan, every dome and column bears its echo. Even where the empire never reached, its influence arrived, carried by missionaries, merchants, and dreamers who spoke in its tongue and thought in its logic. Rome never truly died because it taught the world how to remember. And what of the people? The Romans themselves, the millions who lived, worked, prayed, and died beneath that banner. Their names are lost, but their world is not. It lives in the shape of cities, the curve of letters, the order of thought. The empire was never one man or one city or one age. It was an inheritance of effort, a civilization that believed in the possibility of structure against the chaos of time. That belief survives in every act of building, in every law written, in every attempt to make sense of history itself. To say that Rome fell is true, but it is also incomplete. Rome became the foundation of everything that followed, the invisible architecture of the modern mind. We live in its calendar, we speak in its grammar, we dream in its geometry. Even our ruins are Roman in spirit, the need to leave behind something that lasts. In the end, perhaps this is what eternity looks like. Not endless life, but endless influence. Not survival, but remembrance. Rome's stones may have cracked, its emperors may have vanished, but the echo remains, steady, patient, enduring. It hums beneath cathedrals, beneath libraries, beneath every courtroom and classroom built in its shadow. The empire is gone, but its rhythm still guides the world. And so, the story closes where it began, on the banks of the Tiber. The river still flows, unbothered by time. It has seen shepherds, kings, senators, emperors. It has seen triumphs and sacks, baptisms and burials. It has carried the reflection of marble palaces and, later, the reflections of ruins. The river does not remember names. It remembers movement, and that, in the end, was Rome's greatest gift: motion. The will to move, to build, to continue. Night settles over the city. The air is still. The lamps burn low. The ruins glow faintly under the moon. Somewhere, a bell tolls for vespers, the same sound that once called soldiers to parade and now calls monks to prayer. 1,000 years apart, and yet somehow the same sound. That is the echo of Rome. It fades, but it never ends.